Hello, how's everyone doing today? Doing well? Who loves their city or town? Raise your hand. Yeah, all right. I've had a feeling there'd be those people in the room today. So today we're going to really talk about just briefly what we do and why we do it at Street Plans. We'll really get into what is tactical urbanism. DIY, yes, that's part of it, but we have some very specific characteristics that we look at. And we'll go through some case studies that sort of prove that out. And I'll give you some concluding thoughts, and then I hope we can really have some good conversations over the next couple of days about the projects that you're working on that might actually and probably are tactical. So the American city, when I was growing up in Maine in these small little towns, I didn't really know much about urban decay. I didn't know about Detroit, for example. I didn't really know about Atlantic City. I didn't know about these kinds of places, full of big box retail and cul-de-sacs. But when I got to college and started researching my urban planning thesis as a senior, I got made much more aware of what was happening around in different cities around the country, and that they looked much more like this than those small towns and places that I grew up in Maine. And I was shocked, really, really shocked. And from that point forward, I kind of decided to dedicate my life to trying to ameliorate the effects, the ill effects of these places. Those places that are dull, dangerous, and what we call single-purpose environments. So if you look at all those places, what they add up to, and you project forward, the future looks like it might suck. That's what I was seeing as a 22-year-old coming out of college. Like, I don't want the future to suck. I want to make it better. So getting on that, a couple of years later, 5 years later, 8 years later, I started a company called Street Plans. We started in Miami. I now live in New York City. We maintain offices in both places. And we are a planning and design firm, but we're also an advocacy firm. And that's really, really important to the work that we do. Not only the story that we project, but in fact, the quality of work that we do comes from a lot of the advocacy and research work that we do outside of normal business hours, or a lot of unfunded, unpaid projects, just to inform how we can be the best moving forward and work with lots of collaborators and partners. So yeah, we do active transportation, urban design, architectural design. We do a lot of public outreach and web design. But really today, I'm here to talk to you about the research and advocacy work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. Here's like a small collection of what we've been working on with websites and books and these manuals. And the last three, actually, the Tactical Urbanism Volume 1 and 2 and the Open Streets Guide, these are all free. We realized that after I worked on this book, the Smart Growth Manual, which was a really amazing experience, and got to work with two of my heroes in writing that book, the impact of that, I think, has been good and solid, but it hasn't been great. And it hasn't been great because there's that barrier of price to it. So I wanted to test out this idea. If we've got all these sharing tools, why don't we publish some books and make them available to everybody and see what happens? Fast forward to 2010, I was at this retreat in New Orleans with about 20 of my colleagues, and we were all huddled into a shotgun house, and we were just there to jam on some really geeky ideas for the weekend. And we tasked each other with coming to this meeting with ideas that you wanted to advance over the course of 2 days. And so I had recently moved to Brooklyn, New York from Miami. A large part of that was based on the work that Aaron had been writing about at Streets Blog that inspired me so deeply to leave Miami for a place that I felt got it, was doing all the right things on the streets. But in this meeting, I shared this idea of, well, look, New York's doing these really interesting things with their streets. San Francisco's doing it. Dallas is doing it. These other little examples. And I shared that with my colleagues, and they said, well, you need to write that up. And so that became Tactical Urbanism Volume 1. That's where I applied the terminology to these trends that were happening. And I went away on vacation. And 3 weeks later, after I posted it online from 30,000 feet and forgot about it, I came back and people were talking about it. People had sent me emails. People were tweeting it. It was on Facebook. And I realized that, wow, this really, really hit a nerve. It's not just what I'd been thinking about, but a lot of people are thinking about this, and we should run with it. So that's kind of the genesis of the project. Plans are great, but unless they're implemented, unless there's actually action, they're actually meaningless. So here's a great diagram. This is, you might know, is Manhattan, Midtown. This is Broadway. And in this image from 1969, it's made to look like it's green. So it was planned to be a pedestrian street in 1969. That was really a part of a much larger trend in American cities to pedestrianize streets. But that was probably actually a better idea in a place like Manhattan than anywhere else in the country. Of course, it never happened until 40 years later. Jeanette Siddiq-Khan put lawn chairs and orange cones out in the middle of Times Square. Literally done in a couple of hours, became one of the world's great public spaces with absolutely no urban design, just chairs in the middle of the street and orange cones. And the whole idea is this is a pilot project. We're going to try this out. Enough of the 40-year plans. Let's see if this will work or if it will fail. That idea really sort of demonstrates what tactical urbanism is all about. It's that short-term action that you connect to a larger and long-term vision that enables you to create long-term change. So phase 2, you add a little bit more paint, some movable tables and chairs. Again, nothing major, nothing expensive, really easy to manage. And this space becomes a signature public space in the middle of New York City. They start testing it, taking the data. Cars are moving faster, less people are being hurt by automobiles, retail sales going through the roof. All of a sudden, okay, yeah, this was a really fantastic idea, and it started with just that short-term move. This is the vision for 2014. We can probably critique the design of this space, but actually what's really amazing about it is in a 5-year time span, you're going from those chairs to a permanent build-out. That is what tactical urbanism is all about. Here's a couple more examples, so not just in Times Square, but moving up Broadway. Look at the amount of space they reclaimed from cars. Literally, you got plazas here, and you got bike lanes here. This is the before, this is the after, and that's just paint. This was done very, very inexpensively and has been highly effective at prototyping or demonstrating what the streets of the city could be, long before there's capital funding to really build those out. But before you go and spend millions of dollars on building out new sidewalks and moving curb lines and drainage and doing all these things without knowing if it's actually going to work, why don't we test it? And so again, what happened in New York is what we're finding happening in a lot of cities now. So tactical urbanism is all about getting it right for now and being tactical and strategic about later. As Nabil Hamdi said, who's a great professor who wrote a book called about the art of practice and the limits of planning in cities. And in his work, he's really touched upon this placemaking movement, that we need to be very, very strategic. We need to be tactical about how we implement change. So what is it really? The 5 key characteristics that we always discuss when talking about tactical urbanism. What makes it different from DIY? Well, I think it's always about the vision, connecting it to that long term. But it's thinking about how the iterations and what you can learn from practicing the urbanism, moving it forward very in an iterative way, but always advancing that long-term vision. It's about context. Every neighborhood is different, every street is different, every block is different, especially in older urban neighborhoods and cities. What's going to work locally? What's going to get the buy-in from neighbors and the businesses that are right there? Agility, having a short-term commitment, trying something out for just a couple days, a month, a year, allows the project to be agile because you can learn from your mistakes. If you're failing, that's okay if you've only, trying it for just a short amount of time. You can learn from that, and that can inform the next phase. And in that, you create a lot of value because there's low risk and possibly a very high reward, as we see in a lot of these projects. And finally, and I think definitely most importantly, it's about community. The social capital that comes out of a lot of these projects is phenomenal. And again, I've pointed to New York. That's more of an extreme top-down example. A lot of what I'm going to tell you about today is much more about the bottom-up. Communities getting together, taking action, and making change. And the impact of that can be tremendous. So the rise of this movement, in the second volume, we've kind of added this in as one of these key sort of framing points, is that there's these 3 converging trends of the Great Recession, shifting demographics, which Kennedy touched upon, and the internet and how we're using it today. And I won't go into this in a lot of detail right now because I think Kennedy actually hit upon these points really, really well. But as someone who's coming out of college today, the prospects for employment are a lot different. That lifestyle you expected may not be there. So I think what's really great about millennials is that a lot of them, as we discussed previously, are starting their own businesses, being entrepreneurial, going out to the neighborhoods and making change themselves because no one's going to give it to them as they might have expected 5 years ago. This big demographic of 80 to 100 million millennials is huge. The preferences are definitely shifting. They're shifting rapidly. This article in The Atlantic came out last month showing how millennials have pretty much lost interest in suburbia and driving cars everywhere. Now, there will be millennials living in suburbia, of course, but the interest is actually overall shifting to much more walkable urban places. This culture shift is really being, the energy involved in this culture shift is being applied to old neighborhoods, places that have the good bones that are walkable and mixed use. And Gen Y seems to be a bit more outcome oriented. I heard a generational speaker this year at the National Bike Summit. Was anybody there? A couple people. This guy named Jason Dorsey, and he talked about, there's a lot of things I didn't really fully agree with in his talk, but he talked about Gen Y or millennials being outcome oriented. We want to get things done. We want to go out and do it first, and then we'll backfill the process to kind of codify it later, which I think is a very different way of working. Generations before us, I think, were much more process-driven, at least over the course of their professional careers. And of course, as I've already touched upon, we're digital natives, which is playing out in this idea called the civic economy. fusing all of these open source web-driven tools with a civic purpose. This book here, the Compendium for a Civic Economy, was put out by a nonprofit in London. It's a really fantastic resource. You can download it for free, of course. I recommend you pick it up and go through some of those case studies because it really illuminates this larger trend. And it's obviously not just in North America, but becoming a global movement. And again, this way of working, thinking about the internet and how that's going to inform how we work in real time in physical space. The city is the original internet is actually a quote from an architecture critic who in 2003 was writing about this new thing called the internet. And Facebook at that point wasn't even being used. But I think you're seeing this sharing, this openness, this application of tools, much like on the web as we're seeing now in these neighborhoods. But there's this critique. Is it all just about hipsters? Is it all the Brooklynites, my friends? Or is it just people in these urban neighborhoods? And it's not. In fact, the best interventions and best projects that we document in our case studies are things like this. This is intersection repair. This is everyone from an 8-year-old to a 60-year-old in a really actually pretty unremarkable neighborhood in Portland, just single-family neighborhood. People went out and started painting their intersection. Now, the long-term effect of that is, it's a placemaker. It marks the center of this neighborhood, but it's really an activity that the neighbors could come together and do themselves and empower themselves, meet their neighbors, create lasting relationships, and build that social capital, which is so important for longer-term change. And we always say, though, now that tactical urbanism is not new. Cities have been built this way incrementally for, all throughout history. It's really just in the last 40 or 50 years with the advent of sprawl and everything else that went along with it that we got really far away from this scale of working, especially collaboratively. So who knows where this is? Paris, right. This is the banks of the Seine. And if you walk there in the morning early on, it's going to look something like this with these boxes hundreds of boxes that line the top of the banks of the river. And then later on in the day, it looks like this. It pops up. And when I was researching this, I was really amused. I was actually astounded that this goes back to the 1500s. And these booksellers that were selling their wares along the river are much like the food trucks of today. They really angered the brick and mortar bookstores and booksellers and media sellers of the day because they're out there without paying rent and they could move up and down the street as people shifted all around. But of course, over time, this became codified. They started to regulate the size of the boxes. The word itself, le bouquiniste, got into the dictionary. By the 1990s, 1992, UNESCO named the whole river, the banks of the Seine, a World Heritage Site, including these boxes, which has become so instrumental in the activity that happens daily along the river. That's sort of a 500-year timeline. But portable architecture, another project from the 1970s by an artist named Bonnie Ora Shirk. This is under a freeway in San Francisco. And what she did was she temporarily put grass there, some benches. There's a goat in that image, which you probably can't see. And it was a large public art project. It was a commentary on the lack of green space and public space and connection to nature for people who are living in San Francisco. So that idea, that pop-up park, I'm sure a lot of you in this room have seen this trend expanding rapidly across the country, has roots in the 60s and 70s. And we have many more precedents to go back to even, 1912. So tactics. In our second volume, we've got 24 different case studies. I'm only going to go through a few of these and actually some new ones that aren't in the book. But really what I want to talk about briefly is that a lot of these projects are not solutions. We're not trying to create solutions to problems because the problems always change. And so this quote from James Howard Kunstler, who will be speaking, I guess, later on this weekend, is that he prefers responses, not solutions. How do you respond to a problem? When you have a response, you can keep responding as the problem shifts. If you try and solve everything at once, you may not be so successful, especially in the medium and long term. So this sort of idea of responding to these issues is exactly how tactical urbanists work. They're always looking for that problem and then trying to respond to it in a meaningful way. And always typically in a short term. So we have different tacticians, right? We've got politicians and mayors at the top working at a very high level. We've got business improvement districts, entrepreneurs, nonprofits kind of in the middle, and then really the neighborhoods, activists, and the artists along that sort of that vertical scale. And then we have unsanctioned to sanctioned. And we place a lot of these interventions along that spectrum of unsanctioned to sanctioned. And we've been really studying in detail how these projects move from being guerrilla, bottom-up, grassroots, unsanctioned efforts, and they move along that spectrum very, very quickly to become a more formalized and sanctioned projects. And I'll show you some examples of that. But that's sort of that 500-year timeline with Paris, how it went from unsanctioned to sanctioned. Well, with the spread of ideas happening so quickly now with the internet and the media attention that's being paid to some of these projects, we're seeing not 500 years, but sometimes 5 days or 5 weeks. which is pretty remarkable. So DIY crosswalks, this is one of these techniques, right, where this is a guy in Baltimore. He was sick and tired of waiting for the city to come back and actually stripe in the crosswalks that the community wanted. So in the cover of the night, he went out there and he documented it. He said, you know what, screw you, we need crosswalks. So he did it. This guy, Florian Rivera, he's from Paris. He has a carpet that he has fashioned into a crosswalk, and he carries it around with him. And when there's not a crosswalk, he just rolls it out, right? Not so bad. These people down here are actually part of a larger intervention called Build a Better Block, which I'll talk about in a minute, which also mocks up the improvements that neighborhoods wants to see. And of course, that paint is not permanent. It can be removed, and it's water soluble and everything. Some thank you notes. This is from an article I just read recently in Pittsburgh, where people did the exact same thing, picking up on this trend of striping your own crosswalks. Dear crosswalk vigilantes, thank you. You made my day. A neighbor, So it's kind of this anonymous thing that people tend to do, and not necessarily even trying to take credit for it, but just trying to make positive changes in neighborhoods. Matt Tomasulu, who knows the Walk Raleigh project? Raise your hand. Anybody? Just a few people. Okay, this is a really, really inspirational project. Matt was a recent grad student at NC State over in Raleigh, and he decided to partner with a couple of his buddies to make these very inexpensive signs and hang them up in downtown. And what they're showing you is, destinations, how long it's going to take to walk there, and then there's these QR codes that you can scan to get more information. And what's really remarkable about this was they did this, of course, yes, in the cover of the night. They put up the signs, but they were smart about this because they were doing it very intentionally to meet the needs of a project in their bike and pedestrian master plan, which called for better wayfinding. So it was connected to this plan that was adopted, vetted, approved by city council, and on the shelf. But that's where it stopped, right there on the shelf. And so we want to take that good idea and bring it back to the public and show them what those signs could do in terms of being useful for walking around downtown. And of course, it was illegal, technically. But overnight, the next day, when this popped up, and people took photographs of it and put it on the blogs and on Twitter, it spread rapidly. To the point where the BBC showed up in Raleigh. They wanted to learn more about the project. All this positive media attention was being paid to the city. I mean, how often does the BBC cover stories in Raleigh? I don't know, but probably not that often. So Matt became like this known figure in this world doing this DIY project. And of course, they let the signs stay up for a little while, but then eventually they said, well, Matt, can you please take the signs down? It's technically illegal, a few weeks later. So he did, and then a week later, the city council met. They passed a pilot program that allows for temporary signs for wayfinding, and went back to Matt and said, hey, Matt, can you put the signs back up? Huge success story. And like a lot of these, the good ideas spread, and they spread really quickly. And because so many people like Matt who are thinking this way, they make it all open source. So his platform, you can go and you can download his signs from his website, Walk Your City Project, and you can customize them. These are folks in Rochester doing just that, adding more bike information. The same idea has been applied in New Orleans recently for bike signing and wayfinding. Dallas, just last week, I found this one. Same idea, putting it up. Last night, I was in Virginia Tech, in Blacksburg, and the students came up to me all excited, and they showed me pictures on their smartphones and said, oh yeah, we've done that. And they were showing me their signs, which is really great, which they hung illegally around campus. And apparently, several of them stayed up until, just a couple weeks ago, I guess. And so now they learned from this project, and they told me, yeah, we're going to think about the second phase now and how to make them better. So there's that iteration, that iterative process. So Build a Better Block. Let's see a show of hands. Who knows this project? Wow, very few people. That's great. All right. So Build a Better Block started in Dallas, actually, in 2010. And it was in a neighborhood that looks something like this. This is actually Fort Worth, but had the same sort of, two-story mixed-use buildings. Neighborhood activists got together, and they wanted to reclaim their vacant neighborhood center. And, the street was turned to one way, 3 lanes, it was not safe to cross. The stores were vacant. Not a really great place to be, although it had the potential. And so a couple guys got together with their neighbors and said, all right, city, we know you've got a public event permit. Let's file one of those. We'll make it seem like we're doing some sort of festival thing that many neighborhoods do. But instead of just having, hot dogs and, pony rides, we're going to mock up our ideal street. And that's exactly what they did. And in the process of doing that, they circled all the laws that they were breaking, all the city ordinances, the zoning laws, the things that were preventing this street from actually being vibrant and walkable. I mean, in terms of having sidewalk dining, illegal, couldn't do it, right? So when they mocked it up, it had this amazing impact Hundreds of people came out. The couple of the businesses that were in the pop-up stores just for that weekend became permanent. The city itself saw the potential and said, okay, we love this, why did you do it? And they said, well, look all the things we circled. There's, 100 things here that are illegal in this town, and that's what's preventing good urbanism and walkability from really taking hold and revitalization in some of the neighborhoods in Dallas. And this idea spread really, really quickly. This is Fort Worth. So we see a lot of these patterns happening where one city does something or people do something really cool in a city, the next nearest biggest city tends to copy it and do the same thing. Fort Worth is a really good example of that. And so this is their better block version. And I show these images because they tend to be a little bit better than some of the ones that came out of Dallas. So again, they did this illegally in the middle of the night. Mocked up bike lanes, pop-up shops, outdoor seating, some landscaping. Over the course of the day, more and more people came out to participate. And what's amazing is this short-term action led to some really sanctioned long-term change. The city itself saw the potential, went to the state DOT in Texas and said, we want jurisdiction of that street back, because this was a state road. And they said, we want that because the people in the neighborhood just striped this bike lane and it works and it's part of our plan, and we want to be able to do that immediately. And so the city did that, and then what you see in this image here, those are the permanent lanes being striped into the neighborhood. So, it's a fairly small scale thing, but that short-term action led to that immediate change and that policy decision at the city level, which came completely out of the neighborhood. This idea, again, has spread. This is Oklahoma City. This particular article looks at the millennials as being really the progenitors of this idea and how it was their coming out party for the leaders at that, in that age group. This is a fantastic image. This is actually, that's Jason Roberts' son. Jason Roberts, who was one of the founders of Build a Better Block in Dallas. This is a roundabout. They were just testing. This is a water trough with a hose as a water feature. Maybe $100, but how hard is it to do traffic calming in neighborhoods? People push back against it all the time. In the projects that we work on, we get this all the time. So this idea of just trying it, moving along the stage so maybe some of you can see it, just trying the geometry and making a place out of it and testing it is a really fantastic way of working. So we were inspired. My firm and some of the people I get to partner with in Brooklyn are really inspired by this idea. And we worked on a project a couple months later in 2010 called 48 by 48 by 48. And we're thinking of that in 3 different time scales. And this is a project that was led by a group called Do Tank Brooklyn. They're not a think tank, they're a do tank instead. And so there's a design competition to redesign Long Island, a very suburban place that's suffering from a lot of the ill effects of suburban sprawl. And there was money behind this competition. It was a high-profile initiative. And we didn't want to do just flashy drawings because we knew that's all well and good. That's what everybody was going to do. We wanted to take this idea, partner with the town, go there and actually make the change and submit that documentation as our project. That's actually had the potential of being useful for a town, as opposed to a lot of design competitions get really fantastical, beautiful ideas and pictures, but are really difficult to actually get implemented. So we wanted to use our time more efficiently. And we partnered with their Main Street Association, had a really great partner in Isaac Kramer. And over the course of the weekend, we did one block that connected their train station to their town hall and the post office on either end. And we mocked up a better future. And in the process, we had a public dialogue as well, where we brought in maybe 30 or 40 people into this meeting in one of these vacant spaces. And we had a big table, and we laid out all of their plans. We said, you've had Dan Burden, you've had Urban Design Associates, you've had all the big names in the field who gave you the best tools and the best ideas, and none of it's happened. So if that's actually your history, let's think about something different. Not that there aren't really fantastic ideas in there, but let's go through those pages again, find some of the best ideas that we can mock up temporarily, and just do it. And they got really excited by that, and they saw the potential of this block. And the pop-up farmers market that we had, which was their very first in the downtown, became permanent within 1 month. The 2 of the retail businesses that were pop-up during the day, they came in and rented space to have permanent restaurants and permanent retail space in those vacancies. This guy, who you might have heard of, Billy Joel, also lives in the town. And Billy came out for the weekend with his antique motorcycle collection, which is really amazing. And he just hung out. And he's like, man, this is really cool. This town is dead, but everything's alive today. I want to contribute to this. And so he took the biggest of the vacant spaces, and now he has 20th century cycles in that space, which is basically a museum of antique motorcycles that's a regional draw. So in a very short action to create long-term change, I was told by Isaac, who no longer works at the Main Street Association, that this created about $1 million impact in Oyster Bay, which is phenomenal given that we spent, I think, $1,400 over the course of the whole weekend. Again, this idea is being applied in lots of places now. Cleveland got a grant for about $30,000 to test out the idea of a two-way cycle track or a protected bike facility. It looked like this when they were done. Cleveland's not the most bikeable city, but there's a lot of people who are clamoring for it to be so. And so they mocked it up. They decided to use this money to not only paint it out and show people what it could be, but to take data, to do time-lapse photography, do interviews, qualitative and quantitative, to prove hopefully that this project was viable, and that's exactly the result that they got. And they didn't have to go out and spend 3 years of planning this thing, getting all the public input, and maybe building it and finding out that it failed. They just tried it over the course of a week, and now they know that it's probably going to be successful, and it's worth the investment now. This is a new tactic that I'm calling Futurizing. You may like it, you may not, but the whole point is that you're advertising a future that doesn't yet exist, or a reality that doesn't yet exist. So this is a public art project that started in El Paso. And it was done by an artist who splits time between New York, and he's actually from El Paso. And Peter decided that he wanted to show people the value of streetcars and transit, and that the city itself had a phenomenal, like a lot of cities, streetcar network that was ripped up in the 60s and 70s and replaced by inferior transit. And so he created a campaign that was advertising a streetcar system that wasn't really coming. And he said, the future is arriving on time, on the border again. And, El Paso used to be really connected to the region by transit. And he wanted to bring that all back with just these poster campaigns. And so he put these, he wheat pasted these things around buildings in downtown. He got a dialogue going. People got really excited. While this was happening, the city happened to be working on a comprehensive plan that our firm was working on with a bunch of other consultants. And that idea kind of percolated up through that public dialogue process, so the timing was really good because there was a forum to discuss transit. And what's amazing is that this helped leverage the political support to apply to get $90 million worth of funding from the Texas DOT. Just a few posters built the dialogue locally, $90 million of funding. They've done this study, and they're going to go forward and build the streetcar. And it's going to be something like this, which connects downtown with the University of Texas El Paso and all these walkable neighborhoods in between. Probably going to have a really, really positive impact economically for the whole city. And again, it started with just some public art. So parking and parking lots. How many opportunities do we have to transform our parking spaces to be much more viable places for people, for business, for interaction? The story about the downtown having 13,000 plus parking spaces. Most communities have way too much parking. We could probably do different things with it. So Parking Day, who's heard of Parking Day? All right, many more people. Parking Day is something that actually started in San Francisco in 2005 with an artist collective and design collective called Rebar. Went outside, took over parking space, and started feeding the meter. But they didn't put a car there. They put a temporary pop-up park, laid out some sod, a bench, and a little tree, and said, we have every right to be here and pay the meter. We want this to be a park, not a parking space. This thing, through the help, I think, of Streets Blog and other blogs, this idea went viral. And within a couple of years, it was an international movement. So there's Parking Day that happens on the third Friday of every September. This happens to be Memphis. I was there this year. This is actually from a year ago. But the fact of having a teeter tire in a parking space, it's a lot of fun, right? And it just makes a place more interesting, more livable. They're actually getting a little bit of exercise. But Parking Day was not just a short-term, one-off thing. It's actually turned into this whole movement called parklets. So the city of San Francisco worked with Rebar, that initial group who did it, and they take away parking spaces and they add public space. For bike parking, seating, it's usually associated or sponsored by local businesses, but it's completely entirely public. So you can just sit there without purchasing anything from the businesses. And the idea, they've done this, I think 30 to 40 of them now. They're going to double that in the next year in San Francisco. So every neighborhood you go to has a parklet, at least one. And the economic impact has been huge for businesses because now there's places for people to sit and relax, go in and get the coffee or buy the good or the scone or whatever it is, and then have a place to go out and sit. And New York copied the idea. New York and San Fran kind of go tit for tat in a lot of ways in terms of innovation. And this is not. This is another example of that. We have pop-up cafes. Same idea. Vancouver calls it Parallel Park, which is a clever name. Long Beach, the first parklet that went to Long Beach, as I understand it, I was there last month. One of the first ones that went in, the business that was associated with it, within a month had to hire 4 new people. That was that impact. And so if you think about the city, investing in that, the payback is phenomenal. This is the mayor of, right here, this is the mayor of Ithaca, New York. Is anyone from Ithaca in here? Anybody? I see a hand. A couple hands. Awesome. So your mayor took his parking space. He's 25 years old. He walks to work. He doesn't drive. So he took his parking space and he turned it into this park, kind of as a statement saying, look, we can all get to work probably in a more green way. This is something one of my friends from Florida, he's an urban designer and he works at the county level there. Stuart, Florida is a pretty small little town in his county, and he sent me this information and these images. They put out an 18-month pilot project to test this kind of parklet idea, and it was a really big success. In fact, they found that the restaurants that were associated with it had a 25% increase in sales. So this isn't just fun and cheeky. This is having a really good economic impact, and also, in terms of placemaking, it makes towns and main streets lively and vibrant and destinations again. This is very tactical. This is a project called Parkmobiles, and every city tends to have a dumpster permit system, right? If you're going to rehab a building or gut a building, usually you'll see a dumpster take the place of a parking space. So this is actually an implementation element of a neighborhood master plan in San Francisco, where the landscape architecture firm that was involved with the plan, called CMG Architects, okay, well, we've got this 6-month thing. Why don't we use dumpsters for parks and public seating and not just for trash? And so they have 6 of these as the first thing that got built out of the neighborhood plan, and they move around the neighborhood every 6 months. So every other block gets it for a period of time, and then it moves on. And what's amazing about that is the people who are involved in planning processes, at the neighborhood level, the citywide level, you go to those meetings, you put your comments on the map, you spend 3 hours, and hopefully something comes of that. But what's amazing from this is that something actually did come of it, and they could see it and understand the impact at the neighborhood level, and be really feeling like they had good success early on. So North Adams, Massachusetts is a very small town. It's actually lost half its population. It's in, the mills have moved out. One of my really good friends, Jen Krause, she put on this month-long event called Reimagining North Adams. And we were there for the last weekend to help curate and run something that we call a Tactical Urbanism Summit, and had different things going on. This city is known for Mass MoCA, which is this really fantastic art museum. But again, there's not a whole lot else going on, so they're trying to leverage the arts to bring energy back to the town. And you can see here just a couple examples of, they've got really cool crosswalks and art galleries and murals all over the place. But we're trying to connect some of that to a longer-term vision. There's even a place that has swings under their highway, which is pretty amazing. So we decided to culminate this weekend long of events into something that we call streeting, which is basically eating in the street. So we found another underpass that could have been activated, like they did with the swings, and decided to have a community potluck there to discuss all that had happened over the last month of programming and trying to really connect it to that longer term vision. You can maybe see here, these are the principles that we laid out over the course of a month. We fashioned this dinner table under the freeway, really just with shipping pallets and some lights and some weeds that we ripped up from around the corner. And we had a really fantastic time. But what's amazing about this intervention, or the important part of this intervention, is that there's a bar that's just across the street from this. And they'd never thought of that space as anything other than a parking lot that was empty most of the time. And when we did this, the very next week, they went to the city and applied for a temporary use permit to do something like this once a month. Right? So again, this is not going to be earth-shattering. It's not going to change the economy of North Adams, but doing this intervention led to something that's going to be sustained in longer-term change and help activate that space, which again is usually underutilized. This same idea of the parklets at small scale in that parking space, our firm wanted to blow that up a bit, and so we partnered with about 30 different organizations in downtown Miami to transform one of these 6 median parking lots into a public space. And this was actually been in the city's downtown plan for a while, but nothing had ever happened. And there's thousands of new residents in these new condos that live there that probably weren't part of that planning process. So we really wanted to expose them to this great idea of making these parking lots that are surrounded by 8 lanes of traffic that serve as a barrier between downtown and the signature public space, make it active again. And so we mocked up a quick drawing. We got a really small grant. This is what it looked like in the morning before we did the intervention. We called the Miami Marlins and we said, hey, can we get some of your sod? And they said, sure. And so we had them lay it out and it looked like that overnight. So before and after. This happened literally in a day. And there's them laying out the sod. We had exercise equipment. We programmed the hell out of the space with, bocce ball and yoga classes and food trucks. And the community college came out, and they had student classes there as well, and other activities and concerts. So this place was really busy and alive for 1 week. And it's probably too short now to know if this is going to be built out anytime in the near future. But now we have a whole constituency of business owners and residents who get it. They see the potential of that space. It's a rendering in real time, as we say, and it costs probably just about as much as a really fancy architectural rendering would cost. So DPAVE, a movement out of Portland. This is really sort of ecologically minded. It's about stormwater management. Asphalt is a bad thing, and there's a lot of stormwater runoff that goes into their river. And so neighbors got together, it's kind of the same mindset as intersection repair folks, and decided to rip up asphalt. They started in, maybe 5 years ago. In a very short amount of time, other neighborhoods started clamoring to do the same thing. And the organization became an official nonprofit and became funded by the city, and then they've been funded by the EPA. So that short-term action has led to federal funding in a short amount of time, which is exactly what, sort of that tactical spectrum of unsanctioned to sanctioned. You probably can't get any more sanctioned than that. And they replace the asphalt usually with public space and gardens. Site pre-vitalization is something that happens in lots of places, but this is an example from Brooklyn where they took an old a mall that was demolished. It was a big hole of a site. There was a proposal to make a massive mixed-use development, but when the market fell out, the builder didn't, or the developer didn't want to move forward. So very intelligently, he did a project to bring activity to that vacant site while he was holding on to the land and waiting for the opportunity to build. And it became Decal Market, which is a public space that was made out of shipping containers. And there was a community radio station there, probably 50 different small businesses in those containers. They had events and music and community gardens and all these things happening. On the weekends, it was really, really packed. And it's just temporary. So it's actually now over. It was there for 2 years, and it's moving on. They're looking for another vacant site to bring the market to. But the developer was able to hold on to that land, carry his costs, and now is moving into full development. I personally think it's going to be the trade-off in getting this new 40-story tower won't be quite as beneficial as having this market. But these ideas, they were tested, and he was looking at some of the more successful business owners in that market to bring in potentially to his long-term development. And of course, DC and San Francisco are doing this. One of the final little tactics I'll show is pavement to plazas. This is actually our office is right here. We're in a shared desk space there with our own office there. And it used to be just head-in angled parking. I'll move so you can see. And almost overnight, it became a plaza space, one of the city's first in their Pavement to Plaza program. And you can see the value of this. I mean, this neighborhood in Dumbo, it didn't really have a great public space. And on the ground, it looks like this. This summer, they brought in an artist to do 5 different murals on the plaza, one every day. And so this was a huge event where people started to come in and watch it change over the course of the week. And of course, this is all leading up to, this is what it looks like now, it's leading up to a permanent infrastructure project where this plaza was able to leverage $20 million in investment to permanently close the street next to it, to expand the plaza and connect to the Manhattan Bridge archway. So that short-term move, just using paint in 5 years' time, has led to an investment of $20 million and build it out. And they've kind of figured out what uses work there and how the space can be used moving forward. The same idea is being applied to neighborhoods all over New York right now. This is my neighborhood in Clinton Hill in Brooklyn. They literally take glue, like this epoxy stuff, and they squeegee it onto the street. And they take this sand grip material and they lay it out, and you have an instant plaza. Something that looks like this on opening day. This is extremely cheap to do, and of course, really, really fast. This is the block party that was held that day. They're using the same idea to carve out pedestrian spaces, bump outs, shorten pedestrian crossings. It's really a technique that's a placeholder. They've got a capital budget that funds things kind of on a 5-year cycle, so it's going to be probably 5 years, perhaps until this is really built out, but it's safer and it's better for people now. You don't have to wait 5-10 years to make things happen. That's the whole point. LA is copying the same idea, looking at pavement to plazas. They use that really bright green like in New York, but they've got now this farmer's market, a basketball court, just a lot of things happening. So this idea is spreading rapidly. And finally, there's open streets. Does anyone know what open streets is? A few hands go up. Okay. When you temporarily shut down streets to motor vehicle traffic and open it up to people to use for walking, biking, socializing, markets, et cetera, is a trend that we got really excited about at Street Plans. We got a grant from the Orm Foundation, and we partnered with the Alliance for Biking and Walking, which is a national nonprofit, and we researched the heck out of this movement. And we created an open source website where you can learn about 80 different case studies about this whole movement that started, largely people think it started in Bogota, Colombia in the 70s, but it actually started in Seattle in 1967. Seattle was the first city known to have open streets, so they didn't call it that at the time. But the movement kind of limped along for a little while, but now it's this huge national movement. You can see we've mapped the growth. So just in the last 5 years or so, you've gone from having maybe 7 initiatives in America to having more than 80. And the whole state of Kentucky does this together on the second Sunday of every October, which is pretty phenomenal. And this is done in the county seat in each of their 120 counties. And what's amazing is that they have this one county seat that is known for having the most churches per capita. And I think they have all 400 people or so. But they, on Sunday mornings when church lets out, they have this interfaith, event, which is their open streets. And everyone gets together and walks and bikes and exercises, which is pretty phenomenal. So all this is to say, to quote Fred Kent, that great places are cultivated, they're not necessarily designed. Now, of course, there's always a role for design. Beautiful public spaces are always designed, but sometimes leading up to that point where you want to make those permanent changes, you need to cultivate. You need to see what works. You need to test. You need to prototype. And that's really what tactical urbanism is all about. It's really happening in places that people love. We're not seeing this happen necessarily in suburban sprawl type communities and cul-de-sacs. We're seeing this happen in old neighborhoods that are being repopulated, largely by both boomers and millennials. Places that are worth loving again, reactivating, and enlivening. Places where yoga can happen in the middle of the street and you're not worried about being run over by 18 different cars. And scale really matters. I mean, you've got this little stoop here. That's a movie theater that popped up. This is, again, North Adams. They have a beach party on one of their main streets every summer. They've been doing that for 12 years. Streeting in New Haven in the middle of their downtown. These things happen and make an impact in those kinds of environments. Can you imagine this stuff happening in a place like this? It doesn't work. I mean, the scale is way off. A parklet there can't happen when there's not even on-street parking. So we'd love to find more suburban examples, but we just really don't have them at the moment. It seems like where the community capital is, where the interest lies, is in walkable towns and walkable cities. And we're looking at how these ideas spread as well. We've got this idea from the 1960s, which is the diffusion of innovation curve, which looks at how ideas are adopted over time. You've got your innovators, which is a very small percent, and your early adopters, and you kind of move along the curve from there until you get 100% saturation. Well, we're looking at some of these tactics in the same way. So build a better block, which is, like I said, it's spreading rapidly. We've got Dallas as a city that's, incubated this idea, and you've got Memphis, Oklahoma City, Oyster Bay, St. Joe, Missouri, a very small town. They've done it with success. And we're trying to map and figure out, what point do we get the early adopters and move along this innovation curve, and can this idea scale? We think that the benefit of a lot of these things is that they can. They're really adaptable and can be calibrated to communities of all sizes and types. Again, so just mapping that out, it's Dallas. In 2010, there's 3 of them. And there's several more in 2011. And then by 2012, it's spread all the way out west. So again, we're mapping these things to figure out the patterns that are involved with their adoption and how they're calibrated. But there's really risk in that too. And we want to warn people that we work with that you can't just steal an idea and adopt it. And that's really what this idea, or this quote from Jane Jacobs is all about, is we get really excited. We want to mimic success. It's like you find that new shiny object and you start chasing it. And there's a risk there in that you would just copy and not truly understand community needs and what should be reflective of the neighborhood. And I think that's partially seen in what was done in LA when they took the same idea from New York, same color paint and everything, same polka dots, and just laid it out. So thinking through, if you're going to take on these interventions, think about what really works in that right context. Again, this is not Hollywood, California. This is Hollywood sign in Medellin, which is strange. But again, we have this urge to mimic success. So we're sharing these ideas. We call it versioning, like in software development. We're going out there to communities, and we do salons and summits, and we bring all the different collaborators that are doing interesting things. We bring them into one place, and we jam together for a weekend and come up with ideas and support and talk through some of the challenges and making change at the neighborhood scale. We've done these in Queens and Philly and Memphis. We had the most recent one in Memphis, which is a great success. And we're looking at the way to use these digital tools as well to support the movement. So Neighborland was actually an outgrowth of Candy Chang's project, which was mentioned earlier, I Wish This Was. That's now become a digital platform for ideation. So neighborhoods can go online and talk about what they want, and they can share ideas at that level. But then IOBI is also a crowdfunding platform tool which can fund those ideas. So whoever rises to the top now has a platform with IOBI to be funded, and they really focus as a nonprofit, they focus on environmental and neighborhood scale urban projects. And we think that tactical urbanism is sort of the third leg on that stool, which is really about implementation. How you ideate, fund, and implement. And you put those three things together, and you get a really, I think, powerful and dynamic process that can be really neighborhood-driven from the bottom up to make change. So speaking of change, I think we all know that nothing's really set in stone at this moment. There's a lot of shifting things. We don't know what these trends, what's going to take root and scale and hold. And is it just a reflection of the recent recession and these demographic changes? We don't really know for sure. But what we do know is that everyone can make a difference. And we're seeing that happen from very small towns to really big cities. And this, again, I think this is Gardner, Maine. My friend Kara, who lives there, sent me this image recently. So with that, thank you.